So I was thinking about when you said it was not rational to be Jewish. And you actually, as you pointed out, sometimes one can undermine one's own point. By the end of your talk, you did give a reason to be Jewish, which is that from a particular perspective, one can appreciate multiculturalism. They're not in contrast with each other. And in fact, what I've found is that the more rooted one is in one's own particular culture, the more one can appreciate other particular cultures. In other words, there's no reason to play hockey either. But people do it not just because it's fun, not just because it's what their family has done or their culture tells them to do. They do it because on some level they believe it's good for them, that they can become stronger, more capable, more confident. Well, I think the same is true with our exploration of our Jewish identity. We have a sense of where we come from, who our family is, and there's a unique beauty to being Jewish. Yehuda Bauer, who has been involved in our movement for many decades now, at a previous colloquium said that the Jewish people is like a piccolo in a great orchestra, a very small instrument, and yet if we don't play the piccolo, there will be no piccolo in the orchestra. So that's the unique beauty that Judaism has. You see, the challenge is that we're tempted to say that being Jewish is better, or being Jewish is the best. We don't want to do that. But it's okay to say being Jewish is good. It's good for me. It's valuable. It has values that I would like to project into the world. And there's reasons why people who are not Jewish sometimes explore who we are in a cultural way. We get contacted all the time by people who say, I identify with the Jewish people, I love Jewish culture, I don't believe in a God, but I want to connect some way. Is there a way I can do this? Well, the reason is because what they've seen is what we love. And it's not to say that what we do is better than anything else, but it is to say that it's good for us to do it. So that is a rational reason to explore one's own Jewishness.
Two things. I love the line, activities are fleeting and identity is long-lasting. Thank you for that. And I think that the integration of those two is what really counts, because if you're studying ballet, then I want you to take that ballet and take a Jewish story or something like that and put the two together. So what I do, because of what you said exactly, is to integrate rather than to keep them separate. Although I don't love the idea of calling something a Hanukkah bush. I think a Christmas tree is fine, and a Hanukkah menorah is fine. Okay, and now that I've gone off topic, I forgot the second one, but I'll remember in a minute.
When we think about culture, and your question of making the uniqueness of your own culture within the multiplicity of the other culture, I think is a very important point that enables dialogue with many other people who identify differently. One of the, I think, most troubling things within our society, and not just Jewish, is people who have a weakened sense of identity. And they usually are the people that become even violent because they are intimidated by the fact that they cannot feel empowered by who they are. So as you mentioned, this paradox of enabling dialogue through empowerment of uniqueness is a very important point, and thank you for reiterating that. The other thing which I thought is important to add to our discussion, which was in one of the videos, Professor Malkin makes a distinction between uniformity and being united. And I think that's a very, very important distinction. We want to be united. We cannot be uniform. Can you say that? Yeah, okay. And not only don't we want to be, but we can't. Because once you accept the fact that there are very many different beliefs and that people want to engage with integrity in their lives, then that cannot happen. But we can strive for unity. And again, just like I feel I am a Jew by choice by the mere fact that I make that choice rationally all the time, I think that deciding that we want this unity is what I meant when I said before the oneism. This decision that this is part of my ideology, just like socialism needed an ism to it, to actually get people together. And the last point that I want to make is that we have to get a lot of people together. And this is very complicated. It is complicated for many reasons, but the one I want to talk about is the fact that we can find many people who agree with our ideology, less people who agree with our practice. It doesn't mean that we cannot create this one-manship. We just have to be very creative on how to do it.
So, thank you, Denise. I thought it was a wonderful talk, and I think that the fact that people are responding to different parts, it resonates at so many levels. You know, for me, when you were speaking about the loneliness that people feel, I'm struck by that as well. I think people are hungry for community and not virtual communities. I think that our identities, while they may be multiple, they're individual in that sense. What a community offers is a chance to share our commonalities, to allow us to celebrate as family. I mean, I often say, you know, as Jews, and probably as human beings, but as Jews, you know, we celebrate together, we grieve together. We are not by ourselves. And I think that that's a really important point. You know, when we hear all the different statistics on the unaffiliated and the people who just, they wouldn't join no matter what, they're still hungry for community. And one of the changing demographics when we don't live in the same neighborhoods, you know, not to say that we're ghettoized, but, you know, you can't just walk out your door and you're in the Jewish part of town anymore. The sense of community is not a geographical term anymore. It transcends boundaries, and I think that it's really important that we figure out strategies to create communities that reach out and that find a way to say, we have something relevant to say, we have something important to say, and we have a place that you can come and you can celebrate and do so with integrity. And it doesn't just have to be your local down the street kind of place. So your comments on loneliness really, really, really struck me.
So how cool is it that you are now going to hear one more comment about one different part? So what struck me was the longing and the belonging. And when you look at science, each individual organism is in and of itself, but it's always seeking out to connect to a larger system. And that's what happens to us as human beings. Except as human beings, we're conscious. So there's always this struggle between the individual and the system. And I think what would really be helpful for us is to understand that the struggle is inherent, because I see a lot of disappointment in community work, and certainly in our communities and others, where I thought my beliefs were supported in this community because somebody has a different idea, and then that sense of belonging, you feel like you've been thrust out of your safe place. So we have to work together to find ways to understand that the conflict is part of the system, and that healing the conflict is part of the system. And then I think we will do better in building community when people understand that just because somebody disagrees with me doesn't mean I have to leave the community.
Well, I would just like to ask a generational question. It seems to me that this whole concept that we all need community and we need to be interacting face to face with others and so on, this is certainly true of my generation. Is it so true of today's younger generation? The people who relate to each other by texting each other, or by going on Facebook, or tweeting, or whatever it is. Do they really need or want the kind of face-to-face connection that we think is so valuable? And if they don't, how do we meet their needs, or do we? Or is it important for us to meet their needs? I don't know. I'm raising some questions. I hope somebody has better answers than I do.
Well, no one has all the answers to those problems, that's for sure. And maybe I'm not even of that right generation either, because I grew up without texting and without all of these things. But I think that part of what I was getting at in the subcultures like youth culture and online culture, we do have to think about how we're relevant to people for whom that's who they live and that's how they express their connections with others. I also think that, in my view, there is an emptiness to those connections, and there's a reason why I might not be such a young person anymore, but I teach them, and I know that there is a longing there. I know that even if they don't know what would be good for them, it would be good for them to be connected in a deeper way. And maybe our challenge isn't so much coming to them where they're at all the time, but making them understand why it is different to be in a kind of community where you are together in real time and real space as opposed to virtual time and space.
I was just a few months ago. I was in London, and talking to some young people in their 20s about the concept of community, Jewish people, about the concept of community. And we had the discussion about the internet and the role of the internet in their lives. And about 50% of the people in the room were what is called gamers. In other words, they play many hours on the online and sometimes offline. They play games. And they have a vast community, an international vast community. And they have an annual meeting in which they get together. Now you ask yourself why? I mean, if they're meeting all the time online, but they still need that meeting. And when I was in London at the time, there was one of these conferences. Thousands and thousands of people come together in those ages because they feel the need. Another example is last year, both Yaakov and myself were approached by an atheist group in Israel. And they asked us to come to a meeting. And they came to our house, they explained who they are. They were two young people who are both from the internet world. And we said to them, how many people do you think are going to come? And they said, we don't know, somewhere around 200 people. Said, wow, 200 people, a lot of people will come. So it was, and it was in Tel Aviv, and eventually people signed up, and over 500 people signed up. And we were standing there as people were coming in. And, I get a good sense of numbers in the crowd, and I see that there's many more than 500. And people keep coming, and people keep coming. The room in the hall was for 800 people. It was completely full. Over 400 people were sent home. So, and these were people, remember this, these were people in the ages between 15 to 25. So there is a need for a meeting. We just have to figure out how to do it.
Actually, I was going to reiterate that same point, so thank you for doing that. We do see that the people online have this need. I want to thank Denise for this presentation, and particularly for this idea of longing, belonging. Last week I was reading a book by Shlomo Sand, who is a very controversial Israeli philosopher, sociologist, who wrote a book called Why I Stopped Being a Jew, and made the proposition that there's no such thing as secular Judaism, and there's no such thing as a secular Jew. And he worked it all out in a very kind of scientific and rational way, and it plunged me into despair because the arguments were very clear and very solid. And the entire time I'm thinking, whoa, my goodness, what am I doing this for? And I went to Miriam. It was actually at Shabbat, and I said, what a day I've had reading Shlomo Sand all day. And she said, but he leaves out, well, you haven't read it yet, I know, but you know what he says. He leaves out the most important component, and this is what you were talking about. It's the psychological need, this feeling of belonging. For whatever reason, maybe because he's an Israeli, maybe because he's too cool for school, but he's made a living out of saying that, I don't really need any of this. And yet he's writing books for people in Hebrew who, he has this relationship with. And when she reminded me of this, it made me happy about what I do, because I realized what we're doing here is we're telling stories that infuse people's lives with some kind of meaning and a belonging, and it's a psychological thing. And just because it's not tangible, and just because it doesn't make sense in a well-thought-out philosophical discussion like this man presents, doesn't mean it's not real. It may be more real than anything else, because as humans, we're social creatures, and we seek each other out. And so, yes, there is such a thing as obviously secular cultural Jews, and I know this because we're here.
And that was my point about the intentionally provocative statement that there's no rational reason to be Jewish. Of course, I know that there are rational reasons to be Jewish. I just think, and I'm certainly never saying that it's irrational to be Jewish, but I think if you ask people what's really special or meaningful or crucial to them about being Jewish, it won't be an answer that stems from logic and science and rationality. It will be an answer that stems from the heart. And people who build scientific arguments and very logical arguments about why it's impossible to be a secular Jew are missing that emotional component. And we are very emotional beings. We're rational beings too. But if we discount our emotional side, then we're incomplete.
I remember what I wanted to talk about, and that was home. You said home. And then home reminded me that home we think of as family. And often when we're living on our own, it's also home, but it feels very, very lonely. And as a therapist, what I'm dealing with today reminds me of why it's so important to create community. You talked about dialogue. Well, dialogue has to lead to communication. The point of communication is to commune, to have a sense of oneness and connection with somebody else. And I'm seeing that with couples therapy today, they're not seeing each other. They're not hearing each other. They have no idea. They're so used to you look down. They don't even look at the other person's face, so they have no way of knowing that what they just said actually hurt the other person's feeling. Nothing. There is no connection. So I think it's absolutely essential, if we want to see the future of humanity, never mind just Judaism, that we do create communities that are so engaging and interesting and exciting and attractive that meet this need for communing with other people face to face. Because if we don't have that face to face, we stand a chance of losing the ability of people to relate to each other. You're going to have not 30 million singles. You're going to have 500 million singles who never get married, who never have kids. No, it doesn't have to be married, but living together. We're looking at, I'm sorry to be so big about it, but the potential extinction of society and peoplehood and people if we don't create community.
Yeah. Very recently, the Minister of Culture of Israel made a remark about two recent Israeli movies that she said she was very glad that they did not win an Academy Award. That would go against her cultural identification in a way. Certainly political, but I think also cultural. On the other side of this, I had a close friend who died recently, 50-year friend, who is an Israeli originally born in New York, who ran a Middle Eastern blog. His name was Ami Issaroff. And I had an ongoing online argument with him about why a movement like ours is necessary, because his cultural identity was being a secular Jew, and that's all that was necessary for him. He's Jew, he's secular. We are something that he couldn't understand, and I couldn't, as much as I could not make him understand. And it brings me to the fact that we are not the correct way. I mean, Denise talked about Sherwin's definition of how we are very part of the tapestry of what being Jewish is. You know, we are not the correct part. We are not the way you need to be Jewish. We are an important part, as important as any other part, as important as the Satmar Hasidim. As important, yes, Eva. More important, okay. But we are an important part of it. We're not the correct part. We're not the only part. We are not what it takes to be Jewish. And that's something that it brings to me that what being Jewish is, it's a culture, but it's a very multicultural culture, if that's not, if that's an okay definition.
I want to come back to what Denise said about identities, because she's right. We each have many identities. And at different times in our lives, different identities are most important. Yet, those underlying identities don't disappear. I have a good friend who is a devout atheist. There is nothing about him that lets you believe that he's Jewish until somebody serves a blueberry bagel. and then he will spend considerable time explaining why blueberry bagels just are wrong. They're just wrong. When we talk about the internet generation, I think that we need to recognize that this is a community, and it may be an online community, but it's also a community that is going to seek connections with other people in real time and space at certain times in their lives. The phrase that often gets used in sociology is hatch, match, and dispatch. We come together when we have children. We come together to get married. We come together when somebody dies. Those are the times we really seek community. And as cultural Jews, we support that idea of community. We support inclusivity. We support recognizing the identity of the people we're dealing with. So, and I don't remember who, when you talked about a funeral that recognized the non-belief, if you will, of the person who had died, that's what we're about. And as long as that's what we're about, I believe that there's strength in the communities we create, and we will continue to create communities and to attract people. We just might not be attracting them for everything. But certainly in times of need, they will seek us out, and we'll build those connections.
I want to relate to Can you hear now? Okay. I want to pick up from this term of longing, belonging, community, and communication. And I was thinking about the Hebrew. I think I mentioned in the past that in Hebrew there's no word for congregation. There's a word for community. But the word for community in Hebrew is very different than the word for community in English. Because the word for community in Hebrew talks about an audience, a kahal, that becomes a little kahal, and it's a kehila. But it doesn't have this sense of communication, or it's something very, very different, and I'm trying to figure out why for a minute. But on the other hand, when you think about Beit Knesset, the place where people come to congregate, That's another notion of communication. And maybe for various historical reasons and others, there isn't a word in Hebrew for kehillah. But as I said, invention.
Can I just respond to that? To have an audience means you've got somebody who is speaking and somebody who is listening. And when you have somebody who's listening, there's a good chance of having communication. Who don't listen.
Sivan and Denise, thank you very much for such rich and nuanced presentations. One of the great strengths of our movement, I think, is your last point, Denise, and a point that you brought out in your visualizations, Sivan, is our adaptability. And I think this is one of the ways we can be leaders in the Jewish world. Miriam, you talked about healing conflict. I think part of healing conflict is that in a world in the Jewish world today, which is, I find, very, very polarized, it certainly is in the Toronto Jewish community, primarily and usually around the question of Israel. I think one of the things we have to do is learn to live with conflict. I think there are a lot of conflicts we simply cannot resolve. They're not reconcilable. And all we can do is learn to accept and live with them. And I feel that one of my responsibilities as the rabbi of Arenu is to build a community that is loving and acceptable and open. But then the question becomes, how loving, open, and acceptable can we be? So I'd like to add an image, Sivan, if I may, to your images of the Chanukiot, and that's the Chanukia that is the decoration on a Christmas tree, or the Chanukia that maybe is part of a festival of the Jewish New Year, or even a Muslim celebration, or lighting the Chanukia, as I do in my family, where we have both a Christmas tree and a Chanukia. And what will this mean for our movement? I know this is the next topic, is the future, but what will this openness mean for our community? And how open can we be?
I wanted to react to a couple of the comments that had come across. Some of you may have heard of something called a flash mob. A flash mob is where you send out notification using social media for everyone to show up in one place and do something, sometimes as a surprise, sometimes to make a political statement, whatever it might be. But I think in some ways the flash mob is emblematic of that bridge from the technological to the personal. And the reason why people have a lot of fun doing them is because they get to they get to see other people. And there's something to be said about how there's something to be said. Great cue. I couldn't have planned it better. There's something to be said for how the technological can create a personal connection. I'm thinking of a YouTube video that went around a year, and there's hundreds of these, where a woman who had never had hearing had cochlear implants, and they were turned on for the first time. And she spoke, and she heard herself speak for the first time. She starts crying. It's very emotional for her. And you start crying because you see how meaningful this is, what technology has done, the miracles that people have wrought, right? It creates that kind of emotional moment for you, even through the technology. Now, is she writing a book? Of course she is, because her video now has 1 million hits on YouTube, and the book contract follows shortly thereafter. The other issue I want to grapple with for us, as a movement built on communities, even as we do serve people getting married, funerals, and other broader understandings of serving Jewish community, we don't require membership to do these services, for example, in many cases, is what counts as success for us? Is success lots of people paying dues in a building? Well, that is one definition of success. I certainly wouldn't mind that kind of success myself in the Chicago area. And the Birmingham Temple is to be commended for maintaining that kind of success for 50 years. through ups and downs and turmoil and elation. But success for us has to be understood more broadly. It's meaningful experiences. It could be children that grow up and live out the values of this community, whether or not they wind up somewhere where they can join. It may be the case that someone buys a book and reads it and is inspired. It may be that they visit a website and find a way to celebrate Hanukkah that's more meaningful to them. They may do both traditional and humanistic Hanukkah blessings. But it's bringing those values, that option, the idea of creative Jewish culture, into their home and into their children's lives. This issue comes up as well, to respond to what Karen was saying, in the question of future generations. We haven't yet talked about, and I will be talking about in our closing session, the most recent study of American Jewish life that was promoted by the Pew Research Institute that talked about a lot of interesting details, specific for our movement. But a lot of the Jewish world saw it as negative and found a lot of things to, well, of course, Jews always find something to complain. But one of the things they highlighted was that only 27% of the children of intermarriage were being raised as Jewish by religion. What they didn't notice, and what other commentators later did, is that there are also a substantial proportion who are being raised Jewish without religion, so a kind of culturally Jewish. And there are another proportion that are being raised what they called partly Jewish, which means with some kind of positive Jewish identity in the context of their own multicultural family. So when you add up all of those, the Jewish by religion, the Jewish no religion, and the Jewish and something else, you're over 61% of the children of intermarriage. If you went back 20 years, that number was 25% of the children of intermarriage being raised at least somewhat Jewish. Now the question becomes, can we handle it as a Jewish community when someone who is partly Jewish comes in? And there have been article after article in the last couple of weeks about the children of intermarriage becoming rabbis, and what does it mean if a rabbi wants a Christmas tree in their home? And, well, again, old news for some of us. But the rest of the Jewish world is beginning to grapple with these implications. Will it be challenging? Yes. But as we'll see, the future has never been determined or even one future. So I want to ask if there's any